So, hello everyone. Welcome to our America Explained special event on the English Abitur Schwerpunkt, the ambiguity of belonging in crooked letter, crooked letter. My name is Katrin Büttner. I am coordinating the school programs at the DAC in Stuttgart, and I will be your host during this meeting. As most of you probably already know, hopefully, the DAZ, or German American Center, is a cultural institution that informs about the United States and fosters German American relations. And in addition to a variety of events in our cultural programs that we offer throughout the year, and a language course program for students, and also adults, of course, we also offer free advising on educational opportunities in the US. I wanted to mention that because I think we have a lot of high school students here right now. So if you're interested in spending some time in the US after graduating from school or while studying, feel free to contact us and we will help you find the right program and provide you with unbiased and free information. The presentation you're about to see is part of our school program in which we offer such presentations on a variety of topics for high school students and classes. And with the event today, we want to support all the Abitur students in their preparations for their English exams. So we hope that we can give you a good overview of the topic and the novel Crooked Letter, Crooked Letter. Okay, so before we begin, let me briefly explain how to use Zoom during this presentation. You cannot turn on the microphone and camera, so you will not be able to ask questions personally, but you have the chance to ask them at any point of the presentation through the Q&A tool. I think in the German version of Zoom, it's called F and A. That should be somewhere on your screen, usually at the bottom of your screen. So you can just use that and type in your questions and let us know what you want to know. Let us know if you have any comments on what we tell you. And we encourage you to ask many questions at any time during the presentation. And we will have the chance to ask them in between and in the end, of course, as well. So now I would like to welcome Nora Hoffmann. She is the founder and owner of a language institute where she offers tuition and English courses for all language levels. She also works as a teacher and speaker within the language and school programs at the DAZ Stuttgart. And she studied international studies, German and business at Texas A&M University. She also has a lot of experience in teaching young audiences and is also a real expert when it comes to the Abitur topic, having taught various Abitur preparation courses at the DATS and elsewhere. So Nora, thank you so much for being here today and sharing your knowledge and insight on Crooked Letter, Crooked Letter. You've also done a presentation on Gran Torino, so I'm really happy to have you back for this presentation today. And on that note, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Katrin. And yes, I'd also like to say thank you to everyone who's here today. I know that it's Friday, it's a nice spring day, it's late in the afternoon, but I'll really do my best to provide a presentation that's not only informational, but also hopefully a little bit interesting as well. And like Katrin mentioned before, please ask your questions at any time in the chat, and it's no problem to either write those in German or English. So we will go ahead and get started today, and we're going to first start off and talk about the author. And so the author of Crooked Letter is Tom Franklin, and he was born in 1963, so he's now in his 60s, in Dickinson, Alabama. And he spent a lot of his life in Alabama. So you can see here, he lived in Mobile. He attended the University of South Alabama, has worked there. And then he went on to get his master's degree in Arkansas, and now he works as an associate professor at the University of Mississippi. And so this is a man who is a Southern man. He grew up there, he's lived there his entire life. And he's also mentioned in different interviews that some of the characters from the story in Crooked Letter come from people that he knew growing up or has experienced in his life. And so this is obviously a story that is based on some of his personal experiences growing up in the Deep South. Okay, so this book was published in October 2010. And so at this point, the book is almost 15 years old. And it is set in the American South, and so rural Mississippi. And we'll talk about in a moment what is the American South, kind of what are a few defining factors about it. And the book is written in the third person narrative with a limited point of view. Now, just to review real quick, okay, what do we mean when we're talking about the third person narrative in literature? Whenever we talk about the first person narrative, that's when we are talking about ourselves. So I woke up this morning, I went and I had breakfast. Then a second person narrative would be if I was talking to you. So you woke up this morning, then you ate breakfast. And the third person narrative is anytime we use like he, she, it, they. So they woke up, they ate breakfast. And then when we talk about a limited point of view, that means that we don't know everything that's going on in the story. And so we only know as much as the characters do in that moment. So we have to kind of read the story through the perspective as if we were in the story, as if we were one of the characters, and we're still piecing together all of the information. It also has alternating perspectives. And so hopefully everyone here has either already read the book or at least read really good. So analysis of the book, and you'll know that, okay, at some points in the story, we're experiencing the situation through Larry, then at other points through Silas. And so it bounces back and forth. And also what makes this book, I would say, difficult sometimes is that the events are not chronological. So if you remember already in the first chapter of the book, Larry has been shot. So it's all of a sudden we're thrown into the middle of the story and we don't know, okay, how did we get here? But through flashbacks, that's how we're able to find out, oh, okay, this happened 20 years ago, or now we're back in the present day. And we kind of also have to piece through the story together, not in a chronological timeline. Okay, so before we really get into the characters of the story, I wanted to take a few minutes and talk about the American South, or it's called just the South, the Southern states. And I think this diagram here is really helpful to understand because if you look here, these states up here are also considered parts of the American South. And you might think, okay, this is so strange. These states right here are technically in the middle part of the US or even getting close to the Northeast. And I think it's important to know that the American South is not a really necessarily always a geographic description, because you can see over here, New Mexico and Arizona, they're not considered parts of the South, but it really comes from the historical background of these states. And so maybe you remember from school talking about the American Civil War back in the 1800s. And before the Civil War, there were many plantations and a lot of agriculture. That's how the US economy in the South was run. And that was run on a lot of slave labor. And so the Civil War was fought over two main reasons. One, should states be allowed to keep slavery or keep slaves? And two, the states in the South, they decided You know what? As each individual state, we should have the right to decide what we want to do. The federal government shouldn't tell us what we can and can't do. And the northern states said, no, the federal government should be the one that makes the final decision. And that's what the Civil War was fought over. In the end, the northern states won. That was the end of slavery. And from then on, states always have to have their laws and their regulations underneath the federal government. But you can still feel a legacy of that today in the South because Southern states tend to be more conservative, more traditional, and they also tend to be anti-government. A lot of people in these states don't want the federal government telling them what to do, and there's really much this sense of independence in the states. Now, you might wonder why these states over here also aren't in the South. So when the Civil War was fought, these were still territories. They weren't part of the United States, and so they don't have that shared historical connections like these states do. Now, the story takes place in Mississippi, which is right here, and these states are considered the Deep South. And so you might have heard that before, but the Deep South is considered like the most southern. Then you have other states that are kind of considered the South, but not so much so as the Deep South. For example, Florida. When we all think about Florida, what do we think about? We think about Miami and the tropics. But actually, if you come up into North Florida, they're very similar to places like Mississippi or Alabama. Also, I'm from Texas, and Texas has a lot of history with the Wild West and cowboys, and Texas was actually its own state, own country for a while. And so Texas is kind of like the Bavaria of America. Like we always want to do our own thing and we don't want to get branched in here. So you can see that depending on the history of each state, there's some variation, but there are a lot of shared cultural, more traditional, tend to be a little bit more friendly, I would say, a little bit more respectful in some regards, would maybe be the positive things about the South. But then, of course, we know the negative things with the history of slavery, and then afterwards with the Jim Crow laws, a long history of racial discrimination. And if we look at this picture here, this is kind of how I imagine Shabbat to be, where the story takes place. In a lot of rural parts of the South, this is kind of what the towns look like. But I would also like to point out that this is probably what it looks like in almost all of rural America. The South also has a lot of industry. Texas has a very strong economy, for example. A lot of car manufacturers like Mercedes-Benz and BMW also have production plants in the South. And so it's not like it used to be 100 years ago where, okay, there are only farms down here and then all the industries up here. A lot has changed, but in every state in America, when you go into a rural area, this is about what it would look like. And so, yes, like I previously mentioned, with the fact that the South is conservative, it's considered the Bible Belt. And so it's quite interesting. 60% of Americans altogether would identify as Christian. And that percentage, I would probably argue, I don't know the exact statistic, but it's much higher in the South. And so many people in the South still attend church on a regular basis. There's even a joke, like where I'm from in Texas, if you throw a rock in any direction, you'll hit a church. And it's kind of true. On every street corner, there's some kind of church or church community. And so that's still a very important part of the social fabric of the Southern United States. And this point right here is written in a bit of a confusing way. What this should say is in the entire United States, about 13% of the population is Black, but out of that 13% of the entire population, 50% of Black people live in the South. And so there's a higher percentage of Black Americans who live here than in the other states. And yes, and like I mentioned before, the South is also infamous for racism and discrimination. Obviously, in the very early parts of American history, there were a lot of plantations with slaves. Then that turned into Jim Crow laws. And I would say nowadays so from someone who grew up in the South, obviously I'm white, and so I cannot have the same perspective as a Black American who grew up in the South. But I would say that yeah, a lot of people, because so many Black people live here, they grow up with Black people as their neighbors in parts of their communities. But what's really a problem nowadays in the US, I would say, is the structural racism and the disadvantages that Black people still face. But I would say that happens everywhere in the United States. And so, of course, I can only speak from my experience. I did not grow up in the Deep South. Perhaps that's still different there. But I think luckily, especially with people, so my generation, the younger people, things are changing in a better direction in terms of that. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the Mississippi River. And so the Mississippi River has historically and even nowadays been a very important river in the United States. It starts all the way up in the north in Minnesota and goes all the way down to the Gulf Coast in Louisiana. And so even today, it's very important in terms of transporting goods and products across the United States. In some ways, it's kind of like our Rhine River. So it's the most famous river in the US and is very important for economic reasons. Many cities have been built around the Mississippi River. And the reason why this has something to do with our story or with the book is the complexity of the story is kind of like the Mississippi River's curves. And so we don't really know what's happening. The story isn't told in a straightforward linear fashion, and the story goes back and forth in time. And the reason why this book is called Crooked Letter is this is how some Southern children are taught to spell Mississippi. So we have the Mississippi River. We also have the state name Mississippi, where the story takes place. And this can be a difficult word to learn how to spell, especially because this word is not originally English. It was actually the name of a Native American tribe who lived there before white settlers came. And so they teach the children to remember the S's by saying crooked letter, crooked letter. And that also kind of has a double meaning because in English, when we say that someone or something is crooked or that person is a crook, that means that they're dishonest. There's something shady about them. It's not all that it seems. And we can see that through a lot of characters in the book. They're emotionally twisted. There's something wrong. There's a lot of things that are hidden that we don't know about. Okay, so if no one has any questions up until this point, we're going to go ahead and now take a bit of a deep dive and talk about the protagonists and main characters of the book. And we're going to start with Larry Ott. And so we can see here we have some pictures that talk about important parts of his character. First of all, we have the forest. And so Larry loves to be outdoors. He played a lot with Silas when they were children. They would go, hunting for squirrels and looking for things like that. They like to go and hunt snakes. And then we see here the infamous date night. That's when Larry goes with Cindy, or at least he thought he was going to go on a date with her. And that's the night that she goes missing. And from then on, his life changes forever. And he is considered the primary suspect. He's left out from the community because everyone thinks that he must have been the reason that she disappeared. And then from his profession, he is a car mechanic and he has his own mechanic shop. And so that's what he does for his job. Okay, so at the time of the story, he is 44 years old. So he's a middle-aged man. And if we look back to what we learn about him as a child, he had very different interests compared to most boys his age. And so he loved to read. He loved horror stories, and he was a little bit more, I would say, on the shy side, a little bit more reserved, probably a little bit more dorky. And that's what quickly led to him being bullied in school. And then also the reason that his father was ashamed of him, because his father felt like, okay, he's not masculine enough. These are, more feminine traits or hobbies. He was also always interested in nature and animals. And even from the time he was a child, even before the event with Cindy happens when she goes missing, he was always lonely. He really wanted a friend. And the only person who was willing to be his friend was Silas. And he was his friend until the incident where he calls him the N-word, a racial slur, which causes him to cross the line, and then that's the end of the friendship. Okay, and so, yeah, if we remember, really what happens is when he's a teenager, all of a sudden, Cindy says that she'd like to go on a date with him, and nobody can believe it. But Larry's parents are thrilled. They think, finally, our son is doing something to become a man. He's taking the popular girl on the date. But as soon as they get in the car, Cindy lets him know, no, I actually have a boyfriend. I want to go see my boyfriend. You need to drop me off at a certain place and then make it seem like we went on the date together. And Cindy really uses Larry because he's just in love with her, infatuated with her, and says, sure. And then, of course, when she never comes back, he was the last person that she was seen with, and everyone assumes that he killed her. And so then he becomes socially ostracized, which means, okay, even though he still lives in this certain community, no one wants anything to do with him anymore. So they don't want to talk to him. They don't want to go to his business anymore. And he becomes a boogeyman, which in English is kind of like, okay, that's someone who's really creepy and scary, but there's a lot of myth around them. Nobody has really any concrete evidence for why they're a terrible, scary person, but that's just kind of the stamp that they've been given, and he becomes Scary Larry. So because of this, he's obviously single, and then he lives alone. And even though he owns his own garage, no one in the town will come and use his services. And so he sits there all day and just hopes that somebody will come from out of town who doesn't know him and will need an oil change or a tire. He's a societal outcast. And then when Tina Rutherford, another girl in the town, goes missing, people automatically assume, well, he killed the first one, he probably killed her too. And then he begins his friendship with Wallace. And so if you remember, Wallace was a little boy, and he was always fascinated with this idea of Larry. And so he would kind of sneak around Larry's property. And at some point, Larry put on his monster mask and scared him away. Well, we wait 10, 15 years later, Wallace is now grown up, and he comes back to Larry. And he's so interested and fascinated in Cindy's disappearance. It's just a lot of red flags, and Larry kind of ignores these red flags because he thinks, well, before I don't have any friends and I'm all alone, this guy's kind of weird, but okay, I guess I'll kindle a friendship with him, and we can see how that backfires later when Wallace ends up shooting him. Okay, and then the other main protagonist in the story is Silas Jones. And so Silas Jones is a Black man, and he grew up, or when he was young, he was in Chicago, and then his mom moved them both down to Shabbat. And he grew up in, I would say, close to poverty. So he lived in a very small log cabin. However, he was very good at baseball. So we can see this picture here, and that was kind of his ticket out of the small, poor town. And then many years later, he comes back and he's the constable. So he's in law enforcement and a respected member of the community. So a few of his character traits: he is a person of color, so he's Black and growing up in the South in the 70s and 80s. He grows up without a father figure, so he does not know who his father is until much later when he's an adult. He'll find that out. He lives in Carl, so Carl is Larry's father. He lives in his cabin on their property with his mother, and he soon develops a friendship with Larry, who's Carl's son. So Silas has a much different experience at school than Larry does. He's socially more popular because he's able to play baseball so well. The other students quickly accept him. And he is the secret boyfriend of Cindy, so she is in a relationship with him. but he doesn't tell the truth about his relationship with her after she disappears. One, because he wasn't supposed to really be in a relationship with her in the first place because he was Black, she was white. But two, he knows that if he comes out and says, okay, actually, she was coming to meet me, I was the last person who saw her, then he would be the one who was blamed. And so he really kind of let Larry take the fall or take the blame. And this is something that he's kept inside of him for many years. And so he leaves Shabbat for 25 years because he goes off to play baseball for the University of Mississippi. If you know anything about the US university system, this is a large university, and so he must have been very good at baseball to be able to play there. But as he is now older and looking back at that time, he has a lot of guilt about abandoning his mother. And so he was really the only person that his mother had in her life. And she really kind of did everything to help him succeed. And he feels like he kind of just brushed her aside and ignored her and wasn't there for her when she needed him. And so he moves back to Shabbat about 2 years before the story begins. And like I said, he's a constable, so he's working in law enforcement, and he's the one who's investigating Tina Rutherford's disappearance, which later in the story we find out that she was murdered. Okay, and then a few other important characters to note. I briefly mentioned Carl Ott, which is just all around a terrible guy. And so he really does not have any relationship with his wife or his son. He's very disappointed in him, kind of ashamed of him. And he knows that Silas is also his son, and he likes Silas much better. But because Silas is Black and he also had Silas out of wedlock, he was not married to Silas's mother, he's not able to come out and say that this is my son. But yes, Larry and Silas are half brothers, which we'll find out later in the story. Then Ina Ott is married to Carl, so that's Carl's wife and Larry's mother. And she has a very strange emotional attachment to her son, Larry. It's almost a bit suffocating. And so she talks about, so she prayed every night for a special friend. And you see with both of them, they're so excited for his date with Cindy, but that leads to the destruction of their family. So Ina, she eventually develops dementia and Alzheimer's and ends up in a nursing home, which was kind of, I think, brought on by the mental strain of being completely ostracized and left out of the community. And Carl, who probably already had a drinking problem before this event, really becomes an alcoholic and then ends up dying in a drunk driving car accident a few years later. Then if we take a look at Alice Jones, that's Silas's mother. And so she lived in Chicago with Silas. So she first moves to Chicago after she has the affair with Carl and gets pregnant. However, she moves back to Shabbat because she was living in Chicago at the time, but then her boyfriend got in trouble with the law and she needed to leave. And she is secretly supported by Carl because he obviously knows, okay, this is the mother of his son, Silas. And then we have Cindy Walker, which I think is also a very interesting character because on the one hand, we all feel terribly sorry for her. She has a extremely abusive stepfather, so Cecil Walker, and she's just trying to get out of that situation. But at the same time, she uses Larry and takes advantage of his infatuation or his desperation to go on a date with her. And then, yes, we know that she talked to Silas and wanted to run away with him. Silas said, no, we're not going to do that. Then she runs off into the night, and it's assumed that Cecil, her stepfather, then finds her and kills her. And this was many years ago, but the case was never really solved. It was just assumed that Larry did it. Okay, and hopefully this right here is a bit helpful because for once we're not jumping back and forth in chronology. We've got a timeline that explains everything that happened and when. And so I'm going to just go quickly through this. I've kind of talked already about a lot of these points, but hopefully when we talk about them in order, that'll be helpful as well. So we have in 1979, Silas moves to Shabbat with his mother Alice. And that's the scene where we have Carl is in the car with Larry, and they see Silas and Alice on the side of the road, and they pick them up and they bring them to school. Larry tells his mother, and we're assuming that his mother, Ina, knows what happened because she's not very thrilled that they're back in their lives and that they're living in the cabin. But the boys do become friends, even though their parents don't really want them to. They have a lot of fun together and are friends for a summer. However, what happens that ends their friendship, so we're going to look at this point here, is when Larry lends Silas the gun, Carl finds out, and he very cruelly then makes the boys physically fight over the gun. And Larry calls Silas the N-word and ends the friendship. And I think this is sometimes difficult for non-Americans to understand why is the N-word so bad, especially because in rap music and in hip hop, we hear a lot of Black artists using the word. But the N-word itself comes from the Spanish and Portuguese word for a Black person. And they were some of the first slave traders that brought Black people to America. And so anytime this word has been used, it's always an association with slavery and the idea that Black people are just like animals, that they're property, that they can be bought or sold. And so that's why this word is so emotionally charged and so unacceptable for white people to say, because throughout the history of the word, anytime it's been used, it's telling a Black person that, okay, I think that you're less than human. And so obviously when Larry said that to Silas, the trust of the friendship was completely broken because he thought, great, you're just like all the other white people here who think that you're better than me just because of my skin color. And so, yeah, that friendship ends. And then we know that Silas is secretly dating Cindy. So they are boyfriend and girlfriend. Then we have the disappearance that comes from the date, and Larry is the prime suspect. Then Silas, he goes away to Oxford College. And partially the reason why he goes away is because of this event. He's also kind of worried, okay, what if this ever comes out that I was actually the last person to see Cindy? I just need to get out of here. Larry also joins the army. That's where he learns how to be a mechanic. And then, as I mentioned, this really destroys Larry's family. Carl becomes a raging alcoholic. He drives drunk and then is killed in a car crash. And then Larry is honorably discharged. That means he's allowed to get out of the military so that he can take care of his mother, who kind of also slips into dementia and is just emotionally broken because of this event. Then we have 10 years later, this is when Wallace is just a little kid and he's kind of snooping around, and Larry uses the mask to scare him away off of his property, but that kind of creates this myth of Larry that intrigues Wallace to come back in a few years. So then Silas comes back to Shabbat as the constable. And then Larry becomes friends with Wallace. As I mentioned before, there are a lot of red flags from the beginning, but Larry ignores them because he's so desperate for friendship. Then we see in the present day that Tina Rutherford is a college student who's from the town. She goes missing. They all assume it's Larry. Then Larry is found shot in his home. Then Silas discovers another person's body who's not connected to these events, but there's just like a lot of crime going on in the town at the moment. Then Silas finds out that he and Larry are actually half-brothers because he finds a picture of his mother with Larry when he was a baby. So she was kind of the maid and the nanny for his family. Then Silas finds Tina Rutherford's body actually in the cabin that he grew up in. So she was kind of buried underneath the ground there in the cabin. And he finally comes out and he tells the truth about what happened that night with Cindy's disappearance because he doesn't want Larry to get blamed for another murder. Then Silas realizes that Wallace was actually the one who killed Tina Rutherford, goes after him, is then also shot. They are in the same hospital room, and at the beginning, Larry, rightly so, wants nothing to do with Silas. He can't believe that he's ruined the past 25 years of his life by not being truthful. However, Silas does everything he can to make sure that Larry doesn't take the fall for the Tina Rutherford murder. He also takes care of his chickens and his home while he's gone. And then the ending of the story is quite open. It's not this feeling of like, oh, no problem that you called me the N-word back then, and no problem that you were the reason that I was socially ostracized for 25 years. They don't really make up. However, they drive home together, and you have the feeling that they're at least at a neutral place where maybe in the future they'll be able to slowly build up that friendship again. Okay, so now we're going to talk about a few motifs that are present in the story. So the idea of the mask, or like the scary monster mask, is important. Then snakes are important in the story, and finally guns are important. So we're going to start with the mask. And so the first point here says the monster mask provides Larry a brief opportunity to be socially accepted. So if you remember, this is all the way back when they're still in school and there's a Halloween party. Well, Larry shows up with this really scary monster mask, and all the kids think it's really cool. And so they're like, wow, that's amazing. And Larry gets so excited for a moment because he thinks, okay, this is my end. They're finally going to talk to me, be nice to me. Well, we see that they love his mask for a few hours, but at the end of the night, they don't invite the party. They were just using him for his mask. Then Wallace believes that he and Larry are both monsters. And so for Wallace, he believes that Larry really did kill Cindy. And so he feels like, okay, we're both like this. We're monsters. And then also, if we take this a little bit back from the monster mask and just talk about mask in general, people hide aspects of themselves in order to belong or fit in socially. And I think we all do this to a certain extent. Some people, obviously, much more so than others, but we're not our goofy, crazy self around everyone, probably with our friends or our family. But I think everyone in a society, that's part of belonging in a society, is hiding certain aspects of yourself when it's appropriate and kind of putting on that mask. Masks also provide anonymity, so people don't really know who you are or who's under the mask. And we see that masks also distance you from your actions. That's the reason why Wallace put on the monster mask when he shot Larry, because then it made him feel like, okay, it wasn't me that shot him, it was the monster inside of me that shot him. It provides that extra bit of distance so that he didn't feel as responsible for what he had done. Then, yes, Katrin?
So we do have a question, but I'm not really sure if I know the answer. So let's see if you know it. So the question is, do you know how old Wallace was when they first met, meaning him and Larry?
Oh, okay. So you mean when Wallace was sneaking around the property and he scared him away? That's a good question. I'm actually not sure either, so I don't want to say anything incorrectly, but I got the impression it had to have been when he was still in elementary school, so probably 10 or younger. Because if you remember, there's also the point in the story where Larry went to church one time and this little kid kept turning around and looking at him, and his parents were saying, hey, stop looking at scary Larry. And that was also Wallace. And so I'm assuming he must have still been a young child at this time.
Yeah, that's what I thought, but I don't have any like age in mind that I remember. So yeah, I hope that answers the question at least enough for the person. If not, please let us know again.
Yeah, thank you for
Thank
your
you.
question. Great, yeah. So then we're going to take a brief look at the idea of snakes and why these are important in the story. So one, Larry loves snakes, and Silas and him would often catch snakes in the barn. So that was kind of an important part of their friendship or something that they like to do together. Then we also see the character of Wallace. He also keeps a lot of snakes at his house. And so he kind of sees Larry as a role model in a lot of things in life. And this might be a shared hobby that they have. And then we also know that Wallace is a snake. And so if we call someone a snake, That means somebody who's very cunning, deceiving, they have another idea in mind, they're not truthful about what they're doing, and we see that in Wallace. He's a snake because he says he's Larry's friend, but then he goes and shoots him. And then we also have the motif of guns. And so Larry, that's really the first part of the story. He's found shot with a gun in his hand. But even going back to his childhood, and this is still, even nowadays, very common in the South. I would say most families have a gun, if not more guns. And so this isn't necessarily strange, but his dad has several different firearms. And Larry lends Silas a rifle and teaches him how to use it so that he can hunt for squirrels for a little extra meat for his mom. And then, as we talked about before, this is kind of also the end of the friendship because Carl finds out and makes the boys physically fight in order to figure out who gets the gun. And so the gun is kind of like a full circle moment of their friendship. We have the beginning when Larry lends it to Silas and lets him have it. The end when they fight over the gun and Silas is called the N-word. And then finally, the renewal of the friendship, because if you remember, Silas at the end of the novel is doing everything he can to gain Larry's trust and forgiveness. And he cleans up his entire house, and then he puts the rifle above, I think, the fireplace, or at least in like the safe, and he cleans the gun and makes sure it's nice for him. And so that's also kind of almost like a peace offering that he gives him to try to make up for the guilt that he has. Okay, and then these are some themes in the story. We've talked a lot about friendship and betrayal. So we have the friendship and betrayal between Silas and Larry, between Larry and Wallace. Then we have the guilt and atonement. So Silas feels very guilty for what he has kept hidden for all of these years, and he does his best to atone for it by finding out, okay, who shot Larry, who killed Tina Rutherford, and making sure that he doesn't take the fall for it. Then we have the past and memory, and so we have a lot of flashbacks to the past, and we really see how those events affected the present. Then we have, of course, the issue of racism, this idea that, okay, Silas was Carl's favorite son, but he was never able to admit it because he was Black. Or even when Silas goes to the nursing home to visit Mrs. Ott, she's not being taken care of, and he tells one of the nurses, hey, you need to do something. And she goes, you need to say yes, ma'am. And so there's this idea, even though he is a law enforcement officer there and he's in a position of power, people still think, okay, because he's Black, he needs to give me more respect because I'm white. The book also talks a lot about life in the South, especially in the rural South. And so you can see that the entire town is run down. There's not much industry. The economy's not doing well. If you remember the scene where Silas has to go out to the trailer park and take the snake out of the mailbox, those types of people, it's not a nice term, but is what we would consider white trash. And so people who they are very poor, uneducated, and you get a lot of that in very rural areas where there's just not the opportunity to better yourself in terms of education or jobs. And then finally, this book, the reason why it was chosen for the Abitur is because it talks a lot about identity and the ambiguity of belonging, which is what we'll talk about now. Okay, so just to kind of clarify our terms before we move forward, what is belonging? So belonging is being part of a group and a community, and not only being there physically, but feeling like you belong there, like you are in the right place and that these are your people. That's a feeling of belonging. And ambiguity that's something that's unclear because it can be understood in more than one way. And so if we put those words together, the ambiguity of belonging, that's something that I think all of us experience in life, some people more than others, but it's the feeling of, okay, I'm physically here in this place, but do I really belong here? Are these really my people? Are these really the people that I can take my mask off and be who I truly am? So our identity are the factors who make us who we are. And so it's kind of answering the question of who am I? And how do we gain a sense of belonging or identity? Through identity factors. Now, you've probably heard a few of these before, but many things can make up our identity. Our family and our relationships to our family, our talents, our abilities. A big one is either our race or our ethnicity, our cultural heritage. And so where does our family originally come from? Defining moments or experiences that we've had in our lives, our gender orientation and our sexuality, our beliefs and values, and I would even put religion in with this one is an important part of identity, and our physical appearance. And I'm sure you could add many more here. Really, identity is so multifaceted, and for each person, it'll mean a different thing, or different attributes will have different weight. However, every single human has the need to belong. And so this pyramid is based off of Maslow's needs hierarchy. And so you've probably, if you've ever taken a psychology class or heard anything about that, you've seen these before. And so we all start off with basic needs. Obviously, if we don't get enough water and food, and if we don't sleep, like, we will die pretty quickly. Humans need to be able to eat, to sleep, to drink. We also need security and safety. We need a place where we're outside of harm. So these are the most basic. And then we have psychological needs. We need to have intimate relationships and friends. Humans are herd animals. It doesn't matter how introverted you are, how shy you are, how much you love to rot on the couch on a Friday night. At some point, all of us need to be around other people and have that feeling that, okay, somebody else in the world cares about me and cares to know me. Then we also it's important that we have a feeling of accomplishment, that for each of us, there's at least one thing that we think, you know what, I do that really well. I'm good at that. And finally, this is the most difficult one to achieve. And at different points in our lives, some of these will be missing, we'll have more than others. And this is not something that you reach and then you think, okay, perfect, I'm self-actualized, like I'm done. No, this is a continual process. And with self-actualization, that's when we really feel like we have the time and the mental energy to be creative, and we feel like we're living life to our fullest and we've reached our full potential. And so obviously we want to feel like we belong, because that's important. When we have a feeling of acceptance, we have support from other people, that gives us strength and confidence, and that really helps shape our identity. And if we don't feel like we belong, that leads to loneliness, alienation, which means you don't feel like you click with the group you're in, instability, exclusion, and failure to establish social bonds. And so obviously we can see here, you can live a lot longer without these than these. I think humans can only go 3 days without water, and some people are lonely their entire lives. But then that means that you're not psychologically in a good place. In order to be living life to the fullest, we need to have all of these. So now if we step back from just the overall general psychology, we're going to take a look at how Larry and Silas both deal with their ambiguity of belonging. And so we're going to start here on Larry's side. And so he tries to belong as a child, but he gets rejected. So if we remember when he went to the Halloween party and he had the cool mask, or he tries to show the kids his snakes, they reject him. Then he becomes Scary Larry after the Cindy incident because he can't prove that he's innocent. Then we have Silas, who's very popular in school. They call him 32. That's his baseball number. He's got a very charismatic personality. He's on the baseball team. And so he belongs in the group, but still he hides behind his 32 or his popular identity mask because he's eaten by guilt inside. He knows, okay, I was the one who was there that night. I should be Scary Silas, but I dumped it all on Larry, but he can't admit that guilt to anyone. And so both of them, they don't have a sense of belonging. Their true identity is misunderstood. And in order to feel like they belong and open up to other people, they have to take off that mask that they are using in the town or in society. And they both suffer from guilt. So he obviously, because he is guilty, but Larry also suffers from guilt for the ability, thinking, okay, there's something wrong with me. I am not able to be a part of our society. Okay. And then the way that they deal with this is Larry escapes through books, and so he's an avid reader. Silas goes ahead and starts drinking to deal with the problems. And this idea of the father figure is really interesting in the novel because Larry, he knows who his father is, but he's rejected by his father. So in some ways, it would almost be better if he didn't have a father because his father is just an awful person. Then Silas, he longs to know his father, and he's not able to know who he is until many years later. So, in some ways, both of them don't have a father because even though Larry's father was physically around, he was not a role model to him in any way. And so when we talk about number three, we're thinking about the psychological needs. He had no close, intimate relationship for most of his life. And Silas, who grew up in poverty, was really struggling with the basic shelter, security at the beginning of the story. But then at the end, we see a glimmer of hope and we think, okay, maybe they can actually come to the point of self-realization where they have been honest to each other and that they can have a fulfilling life and a fulfilling relationship. And so Larry is born and raised in Shabbat, but he's not considered part of the town. The people don't want anything to do with him. And Silas, on the other hand, he is from the outside world and he's from Chicago, but then becomes popular and is accepted. And as a law enforcement officer, is a respected member of the community. Then I kind of mentioned this already. Larry is the white son, but Carl, his father, is ashamed of him. And then Silas is handsome, manly, popular, but Carl can't publicly say that this is my son. Then in the end, Larry moves past his guilt. He becomes active, not passive. I think a really important part of the novel, or at least what I thought, is when Larry goes home and he puts concrete at the bottom of his mailbox so that the teenagers can't come by and keep hitting the mailbox with their car and knocking it over. And so that's kind of his first step to say, you know what, like I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not letting people continue to bully me and ruin my life because I'm going to stand up for myself. And then Silas, on the other hand, he finally takes responsibility. He's honest. He tells people what he's done and he accepts his guilt so that they can move forward. Okay, and then in our last little slide here, before we have some time for some questions, this is kind of just a little bit of a review what we've been talking about. So how they belonged at the beginning. Larry is a lonely outsider. Besides his parents, he doesn't have a connection to other people, and his belonging is basically limited to his home and his garage. Silas, on the other hand, is accepted by the community after a while. He might be a little bit more introverted, but he's charismatic. The people like him. And he also has a romantic relationship as an adult. Angie is his girlfriend. Then if we look at the ambiguity of their belonging, Larry, he wants to become part of the community, but he's repeatedly shunned. So we see that from his childhood and then adulthood as well. He has economic problems despite having a middle-class background because nobody wants to go to his car repair shop. And he longs for a friend but remains passive. He just kind of accepts the abuse for many, many years. Then Silas, on the other hand, in some ways is excluded from society due to prejudice. Even though he's a well-respected member of the community, he's still Black, and that's still always going to be seen as something negative for him because people in the small town still think, oh, I must be better because I'm not Black. His life is often uprooted by chance. So when his mother said, come on, we're moving from Chicago, we're moving to the deep south, and also on purpose when he flees Shabbat to go play baseball because he doesn't want to have to deal with the consequences. He's an active member of the community, but has his secrets. And this is also interesting. He's a law enforcement officer. He's supposed to stand up for the law and what's right, but secretly behind his mask, he's a liar. And then in their efforts for change, Larry tries to reach out to others, Wallace, for example, and that kind of backfires. And he also keeps himself busy with tasks and daydreaming. And finally, like I mentioned with the mailbox or towards the end of the novel, he faces reality and he says, you know what, I got to stand up for myself. Then Silas, he opens up to others, first his girlfriend Angie, and then Larry. he takes responsibility for his actions, and then he accepts his guilt in the story. Okay, well, thank you everyone so much for taking your time. And that's kind of the end of the prepared slides. But now we have a bit of time. If anybody has any questions at all, please feel free to type them in the chat, and then I would be more than happy to answer them.
So I would go back because we have a comment on the question before on how old Wallace is. The person wrote back that he or she was curious because on the timeline, Wallace got friends with Larry only 6 years later. So that's why I'm wondering, because in the book, Wallace already lives alone at a farm. So I think, yeah, that's good. So let's see. We have Wallace in 1996, and then 10 years later, they become friends. I think that's, I tried to look it up online right now. I didn't really find anything other than that. And that said pretty much the same, that in 1996, he's still a young boy or young person. And then 10 years later, they meet again and become friends.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Because then that could, if he's living by himself, he's probably like 18 or older. So I'm assuming he's a young adult at that point. And then that would also still work with the timeline that 10 years before he probably would have been between 8 to 11 years old.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And we also had the question, if you could go back to this slide with the snake. We didn't have any question about it. It was just maybe the person wanted to write something down or look something else up. I don't know, but that would be great. Thanks. And now the questions are coming in. So let me start with the first one. How did he confess or take the responsibility? Is that, I think, does the person mean Silas?
I think so.
Probably,
and I think that's
right?
right. That's also a good question. So I think one way that he takes responsibility is that so French, who's the other law enforcement officer, he really wants to quickly end the Tina Rutherford case, and he wants to just quickly pin it on Larry. But that was super important to Silas that he got to Larry first and said, no matter what, don't admit to this crime. I know you didn't do it. So I think that was one way that he atoned for what he had done wrong, was making sure he didn't get pegged for another crime. And I think also by him going after Wallace and confronting him, he then gets shot, but he also tries to go after Larry's shooter, is another way I would say that he tried to atone for it.
Yeah, but he also did go to the police and told them about Cindy, right? At some point.
Right. So the way I remember it, he tells French, who is kind
Yeah.
of like his boss at the police
Yeah.
department. And so I also thought that was interesting in this story. They don't really say like if he comes out and does like a news interview or if he puts it in the paper, you kind of wonder, okay, is he going to go and tell the townsfolk afterwards? But he at least told his boss at the police
Yeah.
department.
Yeah. Okay, great. So the next question. Oh, interesting. What would be a German similar to law enforcement?
Oh,
It's
good.
more like, is it more like an investigator or a police officer?
Right. So a law enforcement is just like the umbrella term. That can be anything. So that can be a police officer, a sheriff, an FBI agent. That's anybody whose job is to enforce or to make sure that people are following the law. And so in the US, I don't know, Katrin, do you know the German translation of law enforcement? Is it like gehobene Dienst? Not
I don't think so. Let me check.
Right. But yes, in order to explain that in English, it's anybody who they're paid to make sure that other people follow a law, and that can be any type of law.
I think it's like, if I check the dictionary, it's like Strafverfolgung. So but that's not like an organization in that kind. It's more like the general thing of
Right.
going, after the bad guys, pretty much. What, you know what I mean? But it's
Right.
yeah, I'd say everyone who's involved yeah, finding like in prosecution, kind of, you know what I mean?
Or
Everyone
I think
who's
maybe another way to talk about that is you could talk about it as the industry. So like professors and teachers and tutors and lecturers, they all work in education. So
yeah,
that's like main term, and there's
yeah,
lots of different jobs underneath it. You could say the same thing for law enforcement. It can be very many different jobs that they all have the same goal in
yeah,
what they're doing.
yeah.
Mhm.
But good question, because that's sometimes hard to, especially between different like cultural specifics and everything. It's a good question. So yeah, then we have the next question. That's how does Larry view his father as an adult? Oh, interesting.
Oh, that's a good question too. Hmm. I feel like we never really find out. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you don't have him kind of dumping where he's like, okay, because of my father, this is how I end up here. I almost feel like throughout the book, it's quite interesting because I think a lot of the emotions that you expect Larry to kind of feel, he just kind of accepts all of the punishment that he's given without really ever saying, okay, this is so unfair. And so I don't remember in the book at any point where he says, okay, so much of my trauma was caused by my traumatic childhood because of my father.
Yeah, but that's just my feeling. I also always had the feeling that he still kind of respects him, and he still like holds on to the shop, and doing the same thing and everything. But yeah, that's just my feeling, of course.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
Then we have a question that's really good. We can go back to a few slides. So someone has a question about the slide with, the guns as a
Mhm.
symbol.
Yeah.
Could you explain the last point that you mentioned with guns?
Yes. And so if we talk about their friendship, so this is between Larry and Silas, in terms of a gun as a symbol, their friendship really began when Larry was nice enough to lend or to give Silas a gun to use, because then Silas was able to hunt in the forest and then provide his mom with some more meat and help feed them. So he really helped him out here by giving him a gun in the first place. Well, then we know that Carl finds out, and he then decides, I'm going to make the boys physically fight each other to figure out who gets to have the gun. And this is when, after they're physically in a fight, Larry calls him the N word, and that ends the friendship. So that's what they mean with beginning and end. And then finally, this point here, the renewal or the beginning of their friendship again, we see that when Silas goes to Larry's house and he takes care of the chickens and he cleans everything up, he also cleans his gun and puts it up on like a holder over the mantle. And that's kind of like a symbolic of, okay, you gave the gun to me first, and now I'm giving it back to you. Like, please kind of accept this as a peace offering.
Yeah, very well explained. I hope that explains everything to the person who asked as well. We also have another question, like, can you go back to the slide, what forms the identity?
Mhm, absolutely. This one right here?
Yeah, I think so. This one, and then maybe we'll wait a few seconds because I don't have a question about it. It's probably the person wants to see it again, and maybe the next one as well.
Okay, so I'll move on to the
I'll
next.
go on to the yeah, that's like I'm not sure. I hope that helped. Maybe maybe I should mention at this point that we are recording the session right now, and we will at least the presentation we will probably publish next week on our YouTube channel. So if you want to go back to any of the slides and listen to what Nora said, you can do that. Will probably be done by mid next week, and then we'll upload it on our YouTube. That's you can just look for, let me put that in the chat. That is our YouTube handle. You can find that here. Oh, I think I didn't send it to everyone. Sorry, let me do that again. So now everyone should get that. And if you go on YouTube and just search for @DAZ Stuttgart, you'll find it. And as I said, I think we can upload it sometime next week, and then you can look at it again and take notes if you need to. So I have more questions here. Do you think Larry copies his father's lifestyle subconsciously or by purpose? Because, you know, like, think that's like embraces thinking this is the right way to live.
Okay, and do they mean like in terms of following the same profession as him, or?
Yeah, probably, you know, living in the same house, following the same profession, doing pretty much, you know, having like the same duties kind of as well.
Yeah, because that's a very valid question. I've actually also asked myself, why didn't he just move to a new town and start over? Like, why did he subject himself to this, being socially ostracized from people for so long? And so maybe it's not so much consciously looking up to his father, because we don't see Larry becoming an alcoholic or becoming very angry. I also don't think Larry is a racist. I think he obviously said something very racist in a moment of weakness, but I think from his character, he's not like that. And so I don't think he has the terrible character attributes that his father did. But maybe it just might also be he just probably didn't know that many people who ever left the town, especially in a small rural place like that. Life is very slow. Like, people don't go on to university, they don't go to the big city to get a job. Like, that's just kind of seen of, okay, this is it. Like, I was born here, I'm gonna live here, and I'll die here. And so I almost think it was something just out of maybe convenience or comfort. Like, where else was he gonna go? What else was he gonna do?
Yeah, I think especially like comfort, I think is a good point, because even though he doesn't really belong there, that's pretty much all he knows, and it's still his home, and the only thing, you know, he feels kind of where he still belongs in a way, you know. It's like, because he's never been anywhere else, he doesn't have anywhere else to go, he doesn't have friends, he doesn't have anything. So I think it's still, even if you don't have a sense of not belonging somewhere, if it's the only place, you know, it's hard to let go of it, you know, and just like, and scary too. So
Yeah, definitely.
yeah. So we have one more question right now. If you still have some, just send them in. So the next question is, I think we've had that on a slide as well. So what makes each character's sense of belonging ambiguous? Sorry.
Exactly. So let's see. So here we have, if we're talking about the two main characters, I think what we just talked about before, Larry is not socially accepted within his community at all, but his family has probably been there for several generations. We're not sure, but we have the feeling that, okay, his family was part of kind of the original group of people who lived in the town. So that gives us a bit of ambiguity. He should be fully integrated into the town, but yet he's completely outside of it. And then we have Silas, who he was an outsider. He's from Chicago, so like the big city. And we have that difference of coming from city life to very rural country life. However, due to his charm and his abilities when playing baseball, he's very quickly accepted by the community. But there's always that distance there because he's Black and most of the people in the community are white. And so, no matter how charismatic he is, how talented, how popular, there's always going to be that thing against him or the way that people think, okay, he's fine for a Black person, but he'll never completely belong and be like us. And so, I think that's another way that we can see their ambiguity. And then later in his life, also, Silas is a respected member of the community, but yet he has a very deep secret about something that really shook the community to its core years ago.
Yeah. So we have one comment on, Larry maybe copying his father. I think it's by a teacher, so that's really interesting. He or she writes, maybe this could help with the question about Larry copying his father's lifestyle. In my English class, we talk about Carl calling Larry mechanically disinclined and how he would probably be trying to prove himself to his dead father as a capable of taking over the garage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a good point. Still trying to prove himself. I think that's a really good point here.
Yeah, definitely. Or also just kind of the irony of the fact that Carl never wanted to teach Larry how to be a mechanic because he's like, you can't do it anyway. And it took Larry going into the military where he was a mechanic in the military. And that's where he earned the confidence or was able to figure out, oh, I actually can do it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then also prove it to himself and his father, kind of, even if he's not around anymore. So yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. We have one more question that kind of fits in here to the ambiguity of belonging or belonging again. To what extent does Larry feel he belongs to Chabad?
Yeah. Well, I would say because he was born there, he went to school there, he grew up there. Like I said, especially like in the rural South and in very rural areas, people tend to just kind of live there for generations. There's not as much movement or moving for jobs as there are in bigger cities in the US. And so I think could be an example. Of course, we don't know for sure, but yeah, maybe his grandfather and great grandfather also lived in this town. And so I think that's how he's connected. And I think that's what makes his alienation or his separation from the town even more painful and painful for his family. Because in such a small town like that, everybody knows everybody. Everybody knows everyone's business. And so it's very closely connected. And so, yes, even though he doesn't have that anymore, he still does kind of have that because I'm sure the people in the town knew his aunts, his uncle, his mom, his dad. So a lot of people in his family.
Yeah. I also wondered if he kind of, he in his role as Scary Larry becomes part of the society there. I mean, that's his role or the role he has for years or has had for years. And that's kind of, I sometimes feel like if he feeling comfortable is probably too strong, but also kind of accepts this role in a way. That's the role he plays or that he has in Chabad, and that's why he belongs as Scary Larry for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's a very interesting point because then it asks the question, okay, is it better to have an identity that's a very negative identity than not be known at all and not have any identity somewhere?
Yeah. Yeah. Good question. So we have one more question that is interesting because we've had that, I think, before we've done this presentation before, and I think this is asked a lot. So do you think it's problematic that Tom Franklin, a white author, writes from a Black person's perspective?
Yeah. I think this is also really difficult for me to answer because I'm a white person. And so I think we would have to ask a Black person about their experiences and how they would feel about it. So yeah, I really
Maybe
can't.
I can tell what Tom Frank. I don't know. Maybe some of the students who are here or teachers have seen interviews with Tom Franklin. He's been to Stuttgart before, but he's also there are a lot of interviews on YouTube or on the internet. He has answered the question at some point, and he said that he had a really close that he wondered about that too. That he wasn't like that it wasn't even his idea, but his friend's idea, who is Black. And he felt like he cannot write from a Black person's perspective. And this friend he had, like, he helped him do it, like he wrote it and then he sent it to his friend. And he kind of gave him notes and told him what he can write or not write. So maybe that helps with this question to answer that at least he got a Black person's perspective on that and some input and feedback on what he wrote. Yeah, let me see. Right now, I do not have any more questions in here, but I still want to give you guys the chance to write. Oh, there is one more. They're still coming in. Good. So, who do you find morally better, or who can you understand more? I don't know if you probably if the person means Larry or Silas.
Okay. Hmm. Well, I mean, in some ways, I always feel sorry for Larry because he really becomes the victim of the story and he never really did anything wrong. I mean, I guess in some ways we could see it a bit heroic that Silas eventually says he's sorry, but then we see the damage is already done. Like at this point, Larry has really been serving almost like a jail sentence for the majority of his life. And so I tend to fall in the camp of I feel sorry for Larry more so than Silas. But I don't know, Katrin, is there another analysis of that, or how do you feel about it?
Yeah, I think so too. I think I feel like Larry is the one who doesn't. I mean, of course, he says the N word. He does some bad stuff, but I think like altogether, he's the one who doesn't. He didn't do anything wrong. He didn't lie. He didn't do anything to Cindy. He didn't do pretty much to anyone, but he's still the outsider. He's scary Larry. He's the one who kind of suffers. So, and Silas, he did some, I mean, he kind of owns it in the end, and he stands up for it, and he says it. But I think, yeah, Silas could have come out with the truth a lot earlier, a lot, at some point. I kind of still understand that he didn't when he was a teenager, but over the years he could have said something, and he still didn't, even when he was an adult, a police officer. Like, so yeah, I agree with you. I'd also say Larry is, I mean, morally better is always hard to say, but yeah, I also feel sorry for him and kind of feel sorry for the way everything went for him.
Mhm.
Yeah, good question. Good point to think about too. Let me see if there's anything else coming in. Yeah, one more question here. Why do you think Alice decided to go back to Chabad?
Hmm. I mean, I think she was at that point just kind of desperate. I mean, she was a single mom. She didn't really know, okay, now that my boyfriend has been arrested and we don't have a place to stay. I think she knew that she could count on Carl because he knew that that was his son. And even though he couldn't publicly admit it, he still felt that connection to him. And so I think she just kind of did it out of desperation, thinking, okay, maybe he can help me somehow because I truly have nowhere else to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Good question too. Going back to the monsters, is would you say you could call Larry or Silas a monster?
Hmm. Yeah. I don't know. That's a good question because when we think about the monsters in the book, for me, three people automatically come to mind. Obviously, Wallace, but then I also think Carl, the father, and then also Cecil, the stepfather of Cindy, who is the real murderer. Um, yeah, I don't know. For me, monster is such a strong word. Maybe you could say that in moments they made decisions that definitely made them put them in a bad light or was not a good thing that was bad. So like Larry with the N-word or Silas admitting the truth. But I don't think I could consider in either of them monsters.
I agree. I mean, they made some mistakes and maybe Silas more than Larry, but I also think, I mean, that's just human making mistakes, and so I wouldn't call them monsters, like just my feeling. um, Another good question here, because that is something that, goes back to Silas as well. So maybe as someone from the South, how would you judge the justice system back then? Um, Despite you're obviously a young person, but um, because I feel like for Silas, being blamed for Cindy disappearing would have been so much worse as a poor young Black man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's honestly a very good point.
Yeah.
Because yeah, I think even nowadays, and yeah, before we get into an entire discussion about that, I think most people will agree that the justice system in the US like systematically needs to be changed. Because statistically, if a Black person is accused of a crime, it's more likely that people will automatically assume like, oh, okay, yeah, they're Black, they must have done the crime. So I think that is a good point. Um, but at the same time, I don't know. I mean, like I said, I'm not that old, but this happened, I think, in the early 80s. I think at that point in time, maybe if he would have just been honest about it, they would have had enough time to go after Cecil and like figure out where the body was or find some evidence in the house that he did it. And so I think in this case, and I mean, I can't say obviously, like I'm not in that situation, but he didn't do anything wrong. Like Silas didn't either. He was just the last person who saw her. But I think people in the town knew what a creep Cecil was and that he was probably doing something wrong. And so, yeah, we can never know, but I still think honesty would have been the best policy there.
Yeah, I think so too, but I get why he was scared. I think, and I agree that it's a different situation for a Black man than being white, in at that time and in that society. Yeah. Um, how did that? Let me just read that real quickly. Yeah. How did Larry react after Silas tried to take responsibility? I mean, they don't become very close, but was he like distanced and forgave him?
Hmm. Well, I feel like once Silas comes out and admits what he's done, and then also brings up the fact that they're half brothers, like that's a lot for anybody to take in. So I think at the beginning, Larry is just kind of in shock and he's just thinking, okay, so many years of my life have been wasted and this didn't have to be how it was. And so I think at the beginning, he really is kind of pushing back. He doesn't want anything to do with Silas. But then in the very last scene of the book, or towards the end, when they're both in the car together, and then Larry tells him, I believe it was the carburetor, like, oh, you need to come in tomorrow and get that checked out. I think Larry is very emotionally stunted. I don't think he grew up in a family where they were able to communicate very clearly or very well, but I think that was his own way of kind of extending his hand and saying, hey, like, let's give this a go. Let's try to move forward.
Yeah, that's what I hope too, that they kind of become closer and maybe friends at some point again.
Yeah.
Now I have one more question that is hard to answer. Do you think Silas is ever going to feel not guilty or to not feel guilty?
Well, if I was Silas, I would always feel a little guilty, because you just costed a person so many years of their life by not being truthful. But at the same time, part of forgiveness, like if Larry truly forgives him, is finding a way forward. But I think just because you forgive something, if you've done something wrong in your life, I think that's human. I think you're always going to have a little bit of regret and thinking, what if I did it differently? But that doesn't mean that you haven't been forgiven or that you can't move forward with your life.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, I think so too. So let's hope they'll be friends and be okay in the future after the book ends. Okay, I don't have any more questions in here. If you still have some, you can still send them in. If we end now, we can still maybe answer some by email or later. But as I said, we will try to publish this presentation on YouTube. So if you want to go back to some parts of it, you can always do that. And yeah, so thank you so much, Nora, for doing this today again, sharing all your thoughts and all your knowledge about the book and about the topic. And thank you to everyone who stayed with us for such a long time. a lot of people are still here, listening to all the good questions. Thanks for asking so many questions, and I hope to see some of you maybe at some of our other events. We will have a presentation next week on Wednesday on guns and gun control in the US. Also a pretty interesting topic that kind of relates to some points of the book as well. And yeah, so let us know if you need anything else from us. And thank you so much for being here, and have a great rest of the day, a great weekend. And of course, good luck to everyone for the Abitur Prüfung. Thanks so much. See you soon. Bye, everyone.